Lesson number 11. Welcome to the user input lesson. In this lesson, we are going to be breaking down how we use user input to create setting menus for our script. So, what you see in front of you right now is my ultimate pullback indicator script settings. This is the most complicated script I have ever written. It contains nearly 1000 lines of code and has a lot of settings parameters that you can play around with. So, this is what a complex settings menu might look like when you get proficient at PineScript. You will be able to create settings menus like this that are well organized and have little tool tips that explain what each setting does, and you will be able to group settings under titles like so. So, in today's lesson, we are not going to create anything nearly as complex as this. We are just going to break down the core fundamentals of obtaining user input from the settings menu. So, I am going to remove the script and open up a blank script. Here we are. So all I have done here is change the plot to NA. So we are plotting nothing to the chart. All of our scripts require at least one plot function or one output function in order to compile. So I have this little plot function here, and I have added the script to my chart, and let us get started breaking down user inputs. Now the first user input I am going to introduce you is the boolean data type input. So get a boolean input value. Now if you are new programming, don't freak out. A boolean, it is a funny looking word, but all it means is true or false. So it is a data type that only holds a true or false value. To get this input, I am going to create a new variable here called input boolean. And to get the input from the settings menu, we need to use the input dot, and then if you press Ctrl space here or command space on a Mac, you will get a list of all of the various user input data types we can choose from. Now don't worry, there is a few here, and I will be breaking down each one of these in today's lesson. So don't feel overwhelmed. But the first one we are going to work with here is input.bool. So if I open up some parentheses here around our input.bool function, and if I hover my mouse over the bool keyboard, we get a list of parameters that this function can take. So we have default value or def val. We have title, we have tooltip, we have inline, we have group, and we have confirmed. I will explain what each of these are one by one. Now, when I am creating my user inputs, even though it says here that default value comes first def val, I actually like to put the title first in my user inputs. So here I am going to title this input just on /off. So this is an on-off input. Then I will declare or define the default value. So for that we just write def val equals, and let us set this one to true by default. Now that is the bare minimum we need in order to get the user input from our script settings menu. So if I click save here, minimize the editor, and click on this little cog icon of our script status bar. If I click on that, we now have a user input setting interface with just an on off option here, boolean option. We could turn this on or off. It doesn't do anything at the moment, but obviously in future scripts We will be using these user inputs to inform the script how to behave. So that is the bare minimum we need in order to create a user input. In fact, you don't even need a title. You just need a default value. So if I save this and we open up the settings menu, we now have our boolean input and the Pine script is automatically assigning the name of the variable to the user input. So we called our input our variable input boolean, and so that is what our setting is called if we do not define a title ourselves. Now these other inputs we have are completely optional, but they are quite useful. So the first one I will show you here is the tooltip. If I write out tooltip equals that takes a string parameter, and this is literally just a tooltip that will appear next to your user input, and you can use this tooltip to explain what your user input does or to give instructions. So I could say turn on off this setting. Now if I save the script and open up my settings menu, we have this little symbol here, and if I hover my mouse over that, we get the tooltip popping up. So you can have a tooltip on all of our settings if you want to, but it is an optional parameter. You don't need to put tooltips. If the setting is self-explanatory, like the title explains what the setting does, maybe you don't need to put a tooltip in. I like to put tooltips in all of my settings. At least in my publicly published scripts, I like to include detailed instructions on how to use my scripts, but it is a completely optional feature. The next parameter we can work with is inline. So a good example of inline how that works is, let me put my ultimate pullback indicator back on here. If I open up the settings menu, here is an example of an inline input. So we have several boolean inputs here, and they are all on the same line, the same inline. That is what the inline parameter does. So if I say inline equals, let us just call it x. If I copy this and paste it to 2 times, and we need to change our variable names here. So I will just say 1 and 2. If I save this script and open up my settings menu, all of us inputs are now on the same line. If I get rid of these inline parameters and save the script, open up the settings menu, they are now all on their own lines. So the way this works is you need to input the same text for each inline that you want to be on that line. So we could have x, x and y here. Now if I save the script, two of our inputs will be on the same line, and then the third one will be on its own line. So that is how the inline parameter works. It is great for organizing your scripts. I love it with boolean inputs like what we have here. For example, on my ultimate pullback indicator, I have a section of the script that allows you to turn on or off certain days of the week. If I didn't use this inline feature, all of these would be on their own line, and my script settings menu is already long enough. So it is really helpful to be able to include simple options on the same line, especially ones that are in the same category. Anyway, let us get rid of these, and I will get rid of the inline for now. And let us look at group. So group is what we use to create titled sections for our user inputs. So here I could say general settings for example. And now if I save the script and open up the settings menu, or boolean input is under its own title called general settings. And any user input that we create in our code that has the same group name here will be placed in the same group. So I can copy this again, paste it in a couple of times. If I save this script and open up my settings menu, all of these settings are under the same general settings group title. You can use inline with these as well. So I could have inline equals x, for example. Save the script, and now we can use inline and groups in our user inputs as well. Now that is as creative as you can get with your user input organization. Obviously, you can also do things like center your text using special symbols and things like that if you want to get really creative with your user inputs. But these are the only options we have in terms of organizing our interface. But for now, let me get rid of our groups and inlines and look at the final parameter we have to work with here, which is the confirm parameter. So the confirm parameter is a true or false value. By default, it is set to false and does nothing. But if you want to override that to be true, you can do that. And now if I save this script, this parameter only applies when you add the script to your chart for the first time. So now I need to remove the script, and if I click add to chart again, you will see what this confirm parameter does. So let me click add to the chart. Now we have a new dialog that is just popped up here that says confirm inputs. So now I need to confirm what I want this input to be before the script will be added to my chart. So if I click apply here, now the script is on my chart and we have confirmed this input. So this setting here is obviously very useful for certain settings in your scripts that are important to how the script functions. So for example, maybe you have a risk parameter in your script that dictates how much risk per trade one of your automated strategies sends to a third party to calculate your position size. That is an important parameter that you might want to add the confirm equals true flag to, so that whenever user of your script adds it to the chart, they are forced to confirm that they have the correct settings inputted and you are not just going with the default values. Obviously, this is an optional parameter for our user inputs, and so I can get rid of that there. Get rid of these other two booleans. Save the script and let us move on to some of the other data types. So what I have just showed you so far is the core fundamentals of the user input function. All of those parameters I just showed you, the tooltips, the groups, the inline, the confirm parameter, all of those can be used across all of our input functions and data types. So we won't go into too much detail about some of those as we work through this list, just to keep the lesson as short as possible. But we will cover the rest of these under inputs. So let us move on. The next input I am going to demonstrate is how to get a color input from your users. So I am going to call this input color and set this to input color. And again, I like to set the title first in my user inputs just because it makes it easier to edit if you have a lot of user inputs like my ultimate pullback indicator. It makes it easier to edit the code if you need to change the titles if you keep them at the start of the input function instead of in the middle somewhere. You can organize these parameters any way you want to. There is no set order that you need to define these parameters in. I am just teaching you my preferred method or coding process. So let us call this user input just color, and we will give it a default value of color.bl black. Now let us save the script. Open up the settings menu, and here is our new input color. And if we click on this color box here, we can select from all of the inbuilt colors that PineScript offers. You can also adjust the style setting menu here. So you don't need to include color options in your main interface if you don't want to. But the option is there for those of you who maybe want to your color settings to be easily accessible for certain plots or shapes in your script. So that is how we get color inputs. Very simple there. So the input color variable will now be treated as color.black, black by default, but the user can change that if they want to. Let us move on to the next user input I want to show you, which is integer inputs or whole number inputs. So here we are going to get an integer input value, and I am going to call this variable input integer, and we need to use the input.int function in order to get an integer input. So I am going to title this whole number, and we will give it a default value of 5. Now the integer function here has a few extra parameters we can play around with. If you read down under syntax, you can see that we also have an in addition to everything we have just covered. We also have mean val or minimum value, max val or maximum value, and step. So if we want to, we can hardcode or define a minimum value for this input. All of these are optional. They have basically ignored by default. But if you have an input setting in your script that you want to make the user or force the user to stay within certain bounds, you can do that with the min val and max val parameters. So for this, I am going to set the minimum value to -10, and I will set the max val to 10. And now if I save the script and open up the settings menu, we have our whole number input here. And if I click the little up arrow here, when we get to 10, it will not let me exceed 10. And same with -10. When we get down to -10, it will not let me exceed that. And if I put in a different number here like 99999, as soon as I click off this, it will be cut down to 9. If I put in 1 lakh, it is cut down to 10. So that is how you use minimum val and maximum val. You can also use step. Now step is used to tell the interface how to step your value up or down when you click on those arrows. So if I set our step to 5 and save our code, open up the settings menu. Now when I click on this down arrow, the number will change from 10 to 5 to 0, -5, -10. 10. So the value is changing in steps of 5. Now it is not often you will use these parameters, but they are pretty handy under certain circumstances. For example, if you are working with a risk reward multiplier like my ultimate pullback indicator does, I have set the step on this to zero point 0.1. So whenever you click on the up arrow or down arrow, your risk reward profile changes by zero point 0.1. So if I leave this with the default one step, then every time you click the up arrow or down arrow, your risk reward would change by a full number, which doesn't give you as much minute control over these settings. Obviously, you could just type in 1.1 into the text box here, but depending on how professional you want to make your script, especially if you are publicly publishing it, especially if it is a premium paid script like my ultimate pullback indicator is, then you want to go that extra mile and make sure that all of your settings are intuitive and easy to use. The step parameter and the min fall and max fall parameters can help with that. Anyway, moving on, we could also use the group and inline and tooltip parameters on this user input, but we will skip that for now since it is the same for all inputs and we have already covered that. You will notice here that we have two versions of input. As a user input function, the top one has the min fall and max fall, step and all of that. The second one has no min fall, no max fall, no step, but has an option parameter. So you can use min fall, max fall and step with your option parameter. But you can define options that you want your user to select from. So to define a list of options in your settings menu, you need to specify the parameters options equals, and then we use the square brackets to define a list of the options. And here I could write 1 comma 2a 3 comma 4 comma 5. Let us save the script and open up our settings menu. Now instead of allowing us to type in a value in this user input, we have a drop down box here with all of the options that we just specified. So this is a cool way to limit your user input to a set list of options, which is useful under certain circumstances. Again, if I open up my ultimate pullback indicator, I use these little drop down boxes quite a bit in my scripts. So a great example of this drop down list is my MA type, moving average type settings. Under this setting, you can select from all of these different moving average types, and the script will change how it calculates the moving average based on what you select here, and that is achieved using the option parameter. We will get to how to use this parameter with strings later on in this lesson, which is what I did here. This is a string option list, but that is how to use options in your integer inputs. The format is the same for any other data type that allows you to choose options. Now color doesn't allow you, boolean doesn't allow you, but integers, floats, strings and all of these will allow you to specify a predetermined list of options that your script user can select from. Anyway, moving on, let us get a float input value. So a decimal number. So I am going to call this variable input float, and that is going to be set to input dot flat. And now we have exactly the same option we had with the integer input. We have mean val, max val, step, and the option version of this input function. So let me title this decimal number. We will give it a whoops. We will give it a default value of minus 0.5. Let us go with a negative number this time, and we will give it a minimum value of minus 3.14 and a max val of positive 3.14, and let us give it a step of 0.01. Let me save this script and open up my settings menu, and here is our new float input, and it will change in steps of 0.01, and it has a maximum value of 3.14. So it won't go beyond that, and it won't go beyond minus 3.14. So if I try to do minus 3.15, it keeps changing back to whatever it was before. And obviously we could also use a list of options here. It is exactly the same syntax to specify a list of options for our input float inputs. So I won't go over that. Once you learn the fundamentals of getting user input, this is all quite simple and intuitive. All of these parameters are the same across all the data types. There are obviously just a few nonsense in how these inputs work. So that is our float inputs. Let us try getting a symbol input value. So this is a market symbol. I am going to call this variable input symbol, and we will use the input symbol function. If I hover my mouse over the symbol, we can see the options we have for the function parameters we have to work with here. We don't have many. We just have default value, title, tooltip, inline, group, and confirm. So I am going to title this just a symbol, and we will give it a default value of SPY. So we will load up the S&P 500 SPY index by default. So let us save the script and open up our settings menu, and here is our symbol input. You will notice it looks quite different to all of our other ones. That is because if we click on this, it opens up the symbol dialog box. So we could choose from any market symbol here. It will only allow valid symbols into this input. So as opposed to a string input where you can put any string you want, the symbol input will only allow you to choose from real symbols. So if we wanted to load Bitcoin, for example, let us go Bitcoin USD from Coinbase. Click on that. Now, if we were to interface this variable in our script, for example, let us say we wanted to get the current price of whatever market the user selects here, we could pass this variable into the function that retrieves that market's price, the security function, which we will cover later in the course. And we can be certain that whatever the user selects here will be a real symbol, and that is the purpose of the symbol input. Anyway, let us move on to the next input, which is going to be a price input. So I am going to say here get a price input. Input price is set to input. So the price user input is similar to the symbol input in that we don't have a lot of options here. We can set the title. So I will set the title price. I will set the default value to let us just go 0.0. And now if I were to save the script and open the settings menu, we could have a number input here that we could play around with. But one of the cool things about this input and what makes it different to a float input is that we can use the confirm parameter here. If we set confirm to true and I remove the script from my chart, save my code and I add the script back to my chart. Let me get rid of my ultimate pullback indicator. Now you can see this horizontal line that is following my mouse. This is our price input. So because I set confirm to true on this input, when we add the script to our chart, the trading view is forcing the user to select a price, and whatever price we select here will be automatically applied to that input. So if I click up here at 1.161 ish and open up my settings menu, here is our price input. So that is a cool user input there, very useful for certain styles of indicators. For example, maybe you want to see how many times price action cross a certain price. You could use this parameter to have the user just simply click somewhere on their chart, and maybe your script can analyze price action around that price to try and find information about that specific price. For example, you could get how much volume was traded at that price or something like that. So pretty cool new input there, that is brand new to PineScript as of recording this. This feature didn't exist a few weeks ago, but we can now use price inputs to usually select that input if we want to. You could also use a float input if you don't want to have the user select the price or just get rid of confirmation. But the option is there. So let me save the script there and we will move on. Let us have a look at another input we can work with, which is going to be our source input. So we are going to get a source input value. I will create, let me make some space there here. I will create a new variable called input source, and this will be set to input dot, you guessed it, source. And if I hover my mouse over the source function here, we get a list of parameters we can work with. We have default value, title, tooltip, inline and group. So I am going to title this input source and I am going to give it a default value of, and now this is a price source. So there are a few we can choose from. A classic example would be the closing price. So if I save the script here and open up the settings menu, this source input here allows us to select from the open, high, low, close. And then we can get the average between the high and the low, or we can get the average between the high, low and close, or the average between the entire candle size. And so this is a great way to allow users of your script to change the price source of certain indicator values that your script uses. For example, maybe you want to change the price source of the RSI indicator in your script or a moving average, and you get the idea. There is a lot of ways we could use this. So that is the price source input. Let us move on to the next input, which is going to be time and date input. So this input will get us a specific time and date. So input time is the function. If I hover my mouse there again, we don't have any extra options to work with here. We just have a title. So I will call this time and I will give it a default value of, and now this time input can take a timestamp value as its default value. So actually I don't need the quotation marks here. I can use the timestamp function, the inbuilt timestamp function in PineScript to get the time value of a certain time of year and time of day. I can use the timestamp function, the inbuilt timestamp function in PineScript to get the time value of a certain time of year and time of day in a certain time zone. So, for example, if I want to get the 1st of January 2000 at 1:30 p.m. in the time zone of 0 GMT, I can write it out like this, but close that off and save the script. Now, if I open up the settings menu, we have our time input here with the user interface dialog where we can select the date. My screen resolutions really turned up for this lesson, so it is not fitting on the screen. But you can see here we can select any date we want and any time of day that we want. So this is a really useful user input for things like time and date filters. So in a lot of my scripts, I have a time filter that I can specify when to take trades between. So I could specify a date to start taking trades and a date to stop taking trades. And I can use that information to analyze price action between a certain date. For example, maybe I want to see how many strategy performed during the 2008 financial crisis. I could set this first date to 2006 or 2007 and my end date to 2009 or 2010 and see how my strategy performed during that specific time period. So that is what this user input is useful for. Just while we are here, I am going to also throw on the group. We will call this time settings. There are a few time inputs we can work with. So I am going to group all of these together under time settings. And one other thing we can do with time, which is cool, we can set the confirm parameter to true. And this is the same way price allowed us to select a price. This will allow us to select the time and date. So if I remove the script from my chart, save the code, bring this down a bit and add these back to my chart. Now you can see this little tooltip pops up. Set the time for the script. So this vertical line now is on my mouse. And I can select any time, any bar on my chart here, and that will change the time setting to whatever I selected. So that is the cool new feature of PineScript version 5. But let me get rid of that for now. CUZ. It is going to be annoying if I need to add the script back to my chart. And that is it for our time inputs. Let us move on here to our next input, which is going to be input resolution. So I am going to say get a resolution input value, and I will call this variable input resolution, and this will be set to input dot. And now this time we need to select a time frame, and this is an actual time frame on your chart. So for example, for a 1 hour chart, you would put in 60 and that would give you the 60-minute time frame. If you wanted daily, you could put in D or 1440 minutes in a day. So let us title this time frame and we will give it a default value of 60, and we will also give it a group of time settings. And actually while we are doing this is a good place to show you how we can use variable to assign our group names. So for example, here we could say get time inputs and let us declare a new variable, a persistent variable that never changes. We will never change this variable's value in our script, and we will call it G capital more time, and this is going to be a string variable, and this is going to be our group title for our time settings. So G stands for group, and we are going to put in here time settings. And now I can copy this variable and paste it into our group parameter here. And now if I save the script and open up my settings, we have our time settings title here. And if we want to change this, all we need to do is change this once. We just change this variable string here, and that will change all of our group titles. So that is a good practice to get into if you are working with lots of user inputs and you want to group them all together, but make it easy to rename groups later if you need to. Now the reason I use the var keyword or v keyword and made this a persistent variable is because this value will never change in our script. So we only need to declare it once. So when our script runs on the very first bar of our chart, this variable will be created and it will never change. We will never change it in our script. So we don't need to. We could get rid of the v variable and the script will still work just fine. But I think it is good practice to do this sort of thing when dealing with variables that never change. This way, PineScript only has to create this variable once instead of recreating it on every new bar on our chart. So that is why I did it this way. But anyway, let us move on. So if I open up my settings menu, we now have our time frame user input, and we can click on this title drop down box and select from all of these time frames. So for example, if I set this to D and save my code and open up my settings menu, this is now set to 1 day. Now if you want to set your time frame resolution input to a number that is not listed here, you will need to use a string input in order to get the value, the time frame value. So that is as good a place as any show you how to get string inputs. So here we will say get a string input. So for this I am going to create a new variable called input string, and this will be set to input dot the string function. If I hover over this function name, we have a bunch of options here. We have our title. So I am going to call this string. We have a default value. So let us set this to, let us say, just for now. And if I save the script and open up my settings, we now have a new string input down here, and I can type anything I want into this. So for example, you could use this to specify a time frame that is not in this list. So let us say we wanted to work with the 10-minute time frame. You could change this to the time frame, this the name of this input, and you could put 10 in there. And then when you pass your time frame into your script code later on, you could just use that user input to specify any time frame that the user wants to work with. But for today's example, we will stick with this as a default string, and I will show you how to create a list of options that we can use with strings. So here I am going to create a list of strings. We are going to have A, B and C, and we will also through a tooltip in here. We will say select an option, save the script, open up our settings, and now instead of being able to click on this string input and type in whatever we want, we have a list of options to choose from. So A, B and C, and if we hover over our tooltip, that will be able to contain instructions on what each option here does. And as I showed you earlier in this lesson, this is extremely useful for all kinds of applications. One of my favorite is to use this to allow the user to select what moving average type they want to use in the script. Anyway, that is it for our string inputs. Let me move this. Actually, we will move this above our time inputs because there is one more time input that I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson, and that is a session input value. So let me create a new variable here called input session, and this will be set to the input session. And now this function has a new option here. Similar to the string input function, we have titles we can work with. So I will call this one session. We have default values. So this is the time session. This is a session between two times of day. So for example, I could set this to 0:30 0 dot. That would be 3:00 am, and 1300, which could be 100 pm. And let us also group this into our G time group, our time settings group. Now you will notice if I hover over this function, we can also add options to this. So we could have an option of a list of time sessions to choose from if the user wants to. I am going to leave this as it is for now so that the user can come down here and select the start hour and end hour of this session. So this particular user input is really useful for things like time filters. So here in Australia, when I am trading the forex markets in the early hours here between around 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., the forex markets are extremely quiet and my spread gets a bit crazy. So my cost of trade is quite high. If I use a market order to enter or exit a trade during that time session, I can be hit with a massive spread, huge slippage on my trades. And so I like to include time session filters in some of my strategies to exclude certain times of day so that my script will not trade or analyze price, generate alerts, etc. during that time of day. And one other use case for this obviously is the opposite. Maybe you only want to script to trade during a certain time of day. A good example of that is my follow the bear strategy. Here it is. Now this strategy only trades during a certain time of day. So you can see on the back of my chart here, I have these red zones. That is a particular time session. For me, it is between 4 pm and 8 pm. During that time session, there is a certain candlestick pattern that unfolds on the euro dollar that is quite profitable to trade. And so I use the time session input parameter so that the user can select the time session they want to trade. Now it says 2 am to 7 am here. That is because these time session inputs are based on the exchange that your market is where your market data is coming from. So even though when I hover over this bar, it says 4 pm down there, it is actually 2 am on my broker's exchange time zone. So that is important to keep in mind when working with time session inputs. Anyway, that about sums it up for our user input settings. This is all a bit messy. We could significantly tidy up this script by using our group parameters and inline parameters and all of that if we wanted to. But because this is just introducing you to these concepts, I will leave it here. In future lessons, we will definitely be using a lot more of the group and inline and tooltip parameters when we start dealing with practical use cases for this information. But for now, that we will do it for today's lesson. I will leave the source code to this script underneath this video for you. Anyway, that is it for this lesson. I will speak with you in the next one.